You're listening to the Virtual CISO podcast, a frank discussion providing the best information security advice and insights for security, IT, and business leaders. Welcome to the show. Hey there, and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtual CISO podcast. With you, as always, John Verrier, your host, and with me today, Mr. Camper. How are you today, Elzar?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Mr. Berry?
Good. A little bit less noisy than Friday when we were originally scheduled.
Yeah, the construction has calmed down in my building, so it's actually tolerable. So much better day.
And I forgot to put my headphones on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Geez.
The joys of living in the city, you know.
Yeah. Listen, everything has pros and cons to it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So, except for software security, nothing but pros there. We can agree on that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So, I always like to start super simple. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what is it that you do every day?
Okay, so I am the practices director of Pivot Point Security. You are my boss, and I was mandated today to be here for this podcast, which I'm extremely excited to be here for. Pivot Point Security, I've been here about 8 months now, maybe 10 months now, actually. And it's something that I've been looking forward to coming back to working with you again. Started, obviously, 17, 18 years ago, my career in cybersecurity with yourself, and happy to be back. Spent, that in-between time in the federal government, working for State Department. Had the joy of being a diplomat for a long time, kind of working in embassies and consulates overseas. So, happy to be home and happy to be back at Pivot Point.
Yeah, well, we are absolutely happy to have you as well. Always ask, what's your drink of choice?
So it's interesting. I was going to say bourbon, and it's true.
But
I know you're
catering to me at that point.
No, you know what it is though. I know you're a bourbon guy, so you've asked me any like real deep questions about bourbon. I can't answer them, so I'm gonna go with extra dirty martinis, vodka.
I can't. That's comical. So over the weekend, I told you that we were out with. I was out with the family when we did a brewery, 3 breweries and we stopped in Brooklyn, and we stopped it for dinner. And for some reason, my daughter looks across the table at me and she goes, "You know what I really want to order? I've never had one. I've always wanted to try it because I think I would look sophisticated." I'm like, "What?" She goes, "A dirty martini."
Nice.
So I start laughing, and I'm like, and so but she doesn't want to do it because she doesn't want to get a bad drink. So of course, what do I do as the good dad? I order a dirty vodka martini.
Nice. But you got to do the blue cheese olives. They take it up a notch. If you're going to try to be really fancy, you got to do the blue cheese olives.
I had just regular olives, and I will admit it was pretty good.
Yeah.
Although she took 2 sips and goes, "Yeah, it's okay," and enjoyed her drink while I kind of choked it down.
Yeah.
All right, so today's conversation is around the software development framework, and as I was preparing for it, I wanted to use the quote, "Software is eating the world," because I thought that was such a great quote. And I could not believe that Mark Andreessen coined that in 2011. If you think about how, cognizant he was of where we were going, it was a nod to how software he thought would transform entire industries. And we've seen that come to realization. And as software has transformed our everyday lives, and it absolutely has, right? It's also transformed the risk environment that we live, right? And the logical reaction to that is greater software scrutiny. And initially, we probably got a little ahead of our, over our ski tips, so to speak. And really, we weren't paying enough attention to information security from an application perspective. And then the scrutiny was around substantive testing, right? Think about, pen testing, and then some code review. And that has not worked terribly well, or we wouldn't have all of the breaches that we have. So we're now in this, I think, phase of shifting left, as you hear people say. And I think the software development lifecycle, right, and the SSDF are the next step in the evolution of shifting left. So for purpose of making sure we're all on the same level, because I think AppSec is one of those places where some of the words and phrases might not be fully defined. Can you first explain what is an SDLC?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that too, because if you Google SDLC, right, you get a couple different definitions, and one of them is obviously software. One of them is also systems. So I think sometimes people see SDLC, and depending on where you fall in the IT world, it could be systems or software. So I think that's the most important thing to start with. We're talking about software, not systems, and they are different. processes. But the idea of an SDLC software-wise is basically just a methodology, right? Now, whether it's formal or informal, the concept is basically for designing, creating, and maintaining software. And how do you maintain the integrity of a piece of software is the most important thing. I think to your point earlier, when you talked about software eating the world, I think it's the goal definitely is to shift left, right? But I think the demand for people to get their products out in the market, the demand of being first to market, it just makes this such a difficult process sometimes because people historically have seen security in the SDLC is slowing everything down. So the whole goal is how do we automate this and how do we really show security as a business enabler and a business driver versus a hindrance,
Yeah, I mean, in all forms of security, right? There's always the balance between managing risk effectively with security and having some impact on the effectiveness and efficiency of operations, right? You're not going to have a control without it having some level of impact. So I think really, like you said, it's a matter of finding that right balance. And I think you're right. I think as we've gone to a more DevOps oriented world, the way that we can find that balance is by automating some of that security.
Absolutely. And you said, I think you said earlier too, it's a risk-based approach, right? Of making sure that whatever you're putting in, the planning and implementation of any kind of security into the SDLC is really a risk-based approach. Not every application, needs the same scrutiny. Now, the high-level practices are always important. The high-level task of, how you go about implementing security into the SDLC is important and can be consistent per organization. But you just got to be careful to make sure that you're not taking the same approach for every application that's developed because every application has different means, different data. They interact with different kind of users. So I think it's important to really take that risk-based approach to make sure that what you're doing makes sense for the organization.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I think we tend to think about taking the risk-based approach on the backside. Like, so as an example, the OWASP application security
Mhm.
verification standard, right? We've got three discrete risk levels associated with that. I don't think most people, including myself, a little bit less than I probably should, really think about making sure that the SDLC is appropriately tailored to the risk of that specific application. And I guess, and we're going to talk about this, but I guess that we would probably determine that through some threat modeling, correct?
Correct, right? Threat modeling, understanding what kind of data is being processed, who the client is, all those things are so important. And making sure that what you're asking from the developers and from the organization is realistic for the arena they play in.
All right, so now we have I think a very clear definition of what we refer to as an SDLC and software specifically. So
Mhm.
what is the SSDF?
So the SSDF, NIST 800-218, the Secure Software Development Framework, really it is 4 practices and 42 tasks that it tells an organization, kind of outlines for them what they can do to improve the integrity of their software. It can be used by any sector. It can be whether it's going to be for Internet of Things devices, whether it's going to be for critical applications, web browsers, whatever it is. It's something that there's these different practices and tasks or things that can be integrated into any SDLC, and it allows you to kind of set kind of future targets. So, if your organization initially, you look at the 4 practices and the 42 tasks, and you say, okay, we're able to achieve 20 of these, in this year, and then you start to roll into different tasks as the maturity of the SDLC progresses, it kind of gives you a target. And it's kind of that's the really nice thing about it. It doesn't have built-in maturity levels into it, but it does reference other standards that do have built-in maturity models, such as like the BSIM or whether it's OWASP SAM, things like that. And I think from the last thing it really does is it allows like another organization. So when they're acquiring software, they can have kind of an independent kind of framework to say, hey, where do you stand on the SSDF? Now, said before, the SSDF references many, many other frameworks, which is the nice thing about it. But it does kind of give that, government standard that maybe one approach, high level approach of things organizations can do to really kind of give, a third party or the government an understanding of how a piece of software was built.
Gotcha. And in terms of breaking it down a little bit more than that,
Yeah,
can
yeah,
you maybe break down the
absolutely.
standard a little bit, maybe at least at large group level, and explain some of the things that it
Yep,
does cover? Okay, thanks.
yep. So 4 practices, right? So the first practice is prepare the organization. That has like 13 kind of general tasks. And this is things talking about documenting your security requirements, the policies, the procedures, the standards around what does your organization need to do to build secure software and maintain the integrity of the software. It also gets into things of like how do you communicate to third parties, whether it be your clients, whether it be the government, whether it be a subcontractor who's developing a module for the piece of software, things like that. It really gets into the SDLC roles and responsibilities, which is nice. So it's actually mapped to the NIST 800 181, I believe, document, the NIST framework, right? And the nice thing about it, it actually identifies a different task associated with different parts of the standard. So if we're talking about this instance of prepare the organization and you have a software developer or you have a security analyst, something like that, it actually tells you the actual kind of task that individual is going to need to do as part of their job to help the organization meet that part of the that practice, for example. It also talks about executive support. So like any good standard, if you're talking like, for example, ISO, right, 27001, that having that executive support to make sure that the standard is going to be actually adopted internally, operationalized, and actually be implemented across the board, which is great. And then it gets into things like securing endpoints, developer machines, EDRs. Do you have an EDR? Do you have an XDR? Things like that. And that's kind of the high level, like the first one, right? How do you prepare your organization to get ready to adopt this standard? There's 3 other practices too, so we can get into those if you want.
Gotcha. Yeah, I would like that. So prepare the organization is sort of that understand where we are and where we're going.
Yeah.
Which is
Yes,
fundamental,
exactly.
fundamental, I think. And I really do like
And document it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Everybody's favorite.
If it isn't documented, it
Yeah.
doesn't exist from an auditor's
Exactly.
perspective, right?
Yeah.
And I do like the fact that you emphasize the importance of governance and of management's commitment. And if you're listening to this podcast and you're somebody who is responsible for at a CXO level for an organization that develops software, at the end of the day, if you don't have tone at the top, you are not going to have, secure software by design, which is what we're trying to get to. So I'm glad you actually stressed that.
That's extremely important because you know how it is, right? If you can have all the policies and procedures and standards you want, but if no one thinks it's important and no one's pushing it, it's not going to go anywhere. It's just going to be kind of like, it's like, oh, put that on the shelf, like that's for the auditors, but this is how we do it. So you don't want that to happen. You want to merge those two, obviously, and have an effective program at the end of the day.
Gotcha. And you said there were 4 main domains.
There's 3 others.
Yeah. So what's
so
2?
Practices, right? So number 2 is going to be protect the software, and this is you really get into the focus of the integrity of the software. How is the software being built? Where is the software being stored? Are you using a code repository? What kind of access people have to that repository? How are you doing hashes for released files? How is the software being checked out? And this is when it gets into one of the bigger terms that people would like to talk about is the SBOM, right? The software bill of materials. Is that available for the piece of software? And then is it not only available, is it updated every time the software is released? Because an SBOM is great. It gives you a really good understanding of the different third-party libraries that might be associated with that piece of software, all the different open source technologies that have been incorporated into the application, and you need to understand, what versions are they? Are they vulnerable? And if so, how do you identify them proactively? And that's where the SBOM comes into play. The biggest thing, though, is it can't just be a one-time snapshot of every time you do a new release. You need that updated SBOM to kind of show, okay, we know it's in this version, we know it's in this version. So any organization that can look and see, okay, I'm running, version 14.7, it's very clear of what third-party libraries are actually included in that version.
So would it be wrong to think of an SBOM as sort of the ingredients label on the food packaging that I just bought?
I think that's a very good way to think about it. Okay. Yeah.
And then
without the calories,
right?
Yeah.
And then I think the only difference maybe with an SBOM is that on a food label I might see food coloring yellow number 3, and I might recognize that might have negative impact to me as a consumer. And the SBOM, right? The idea behind that is that if we're using third-party libraries, if those libraries have some known flaw, some known vulnerability, that should advertise that to me in the same way that seeing artificial colorings and flavorings that I don't want to eat in my food, I wouldn't want to have these bad libraries, if you will, in my software food.
It should. And the interesting thing is how detailed is an SBOM, right? And, internally you run an SBOM, it should do exactly what you just said, right? It should tell you what vulnerabilities are associated with certain libraries and certain pieces of software. The question is, if people start producing these and they're making them, readily available, at what level do you filter that information? Do you filter it to the individual buying the software? Do you make it available on your website? It's obviously going to be very sensitive, so there's things you're not going to want to disclose. But definitely, I mean, that's the idea of it. But an SBOM is only going to be as effective as the piece of software that's also identifying the particular vulnerabilities within those third parties, right? So you can generate one that says this is what we have in it, but then if it's on the purchaser to scrutinize every piece, every DLL, whatever's in there, like that's just not sustainable. So it has to be more of a proactive response to, okay, we generate an SBOM, and then it's whether it's greens and reds or something like that to show the internal staff of, hey, okay, we should really update these or remove ones that if we can that are vulnerable. But you really need the context of, okay, not only do we know what's in it, we know it's vulnerable, and that process is automated.
So you brought up something that I hadn't, and this is why I love chatting with people, is that I think of things that I didn't think of. And, I didn't really think about that idea that much the same way that, like we've worked with a bakery that had that sold like $20 million worth of a certain product through a very famous store. And they had, the highest level of security I've ever seen to keep the ingredients in this baked item, secret. To some extent, do orgs want to keep the ingredients in their application secret? And then how do we balance that disclosure, versus their right to having, if that list might be some level of intellectual property from their perspective?
I think it's a great point. And to be honest, I don't know. I mean, how do you, where's the line? And then who gets to draw the line? When you're dealing with the government, they're going to draw the line. Like if you're going to want to sell, if you're going to want to sell government or software to the government, they're going to tell you exactly what they're going to want from you. Now, whether that's a very detailed SBOM or just a hey, we have one if you want to see it, I expect it to be somewhere in between that. The interesting thing to your point, though, if you're selling another piece of software or a piece of software to another organization, do they really have? I mean, how much can they ask about? Because if where is that line of this is all the ingredients to our secret sauce, right? And I haven't thought about that, but it's a really good point of how much do you turn over? And then what is it if most of your application is open source, right, versus what you've actually written? And then does that change what they're going to view as being your product versus
And even the value of
this
the
is
product.
mostly open source?
Yeah, hey,
Exactly,
wow,
right?
you're charging us $100,000. I mean, basically, you just glued together a
Yeah,
bunch of libraries. What would prevent us from doing that?
exactly, right. So it's interesting. It's interesting. I don't know. What's going to happen. But I'm curious. I guess we'll find out. So I'm curious to see how that works out.
Yeah, there's one other thing that you also made me think about that I hadn't thought about is that, um, there's the one side of I'm getting the SBOM and you're confirming to me that you don't have vulnerabilities in the libraries that you're using. But the other side value of having an SBOM about what's in your software is like when we had the OpenSSL problem, right? How many products were using that OpenSSL? And that gives me the ability to proactively take action because I could then at that point maintain a database of all the critical apps that I have exposed. And if a vuln gets published, I can say, do any of the applications that we use this in their library? And if so, how do I throw a web application firewall up? Or how do I take down that application till then? Or how do I get in touch with the vendor to ask them if they've got a patch and get that patch deployed as quickly as possible?
No, absolutely. I think that's kind of the point, right? But I think too is what happens when you come across these libraries that can't be quickly fixed, or the WAF is not going to work for. And I guess and I'm never going to say ignorance is bliss, but there are times when you might then point out so many different the amount of information that comes out on a daily basis around anything information security is hard to digest, right? When it comes out to different vulnerabilities, critical flaws, everything that comes out. And I agree with you 1,000% that you definitely want to know when something that you're hosting has a vulnerable piece of software. But I guess the question is, if that's known to the public, if that's a vulnerable critical, there's a critical piece of this one module, this one DLL, whatever it is vulnerable, and that SBOM is known to the public, does that increase that
Threat surface.
the attacks that
Yep.
are now going to take place?
Yep.
So good and bad that comes with it. You definitely want to know. It's definitely a big benefit if you can do something about it. But also, if you can't do anything about it, it does increase your attack
Yeah,
surface.
and
So,
I agree with you. I don't think that it'll be general practice to take an SBOM and post it on the internet on your website
right.
for
You would
that
hope.
reason, right? Because I
Right.
mean, and even if if there's a 0 day out there, right, that you don't know about, but some bad guy does, he can then go around and say, okay, hey, I don't have to look for the software that might be vulnerable to this. These guys were nice enough to publish
Right.
it for me. All right, so we
Right.
beat up practice 2, protect the software. What's practice 3?
Yes. Practice 3 is going to be produce well secure software. So this has like 16 tasks. This is where we kind of get into things we talked about earlier: risk modeling, threat modeling. How do you track risk? How does risk affects your design decisions? Are you using standard? So for example, this is kind of like not reinventing the wheel. And this is where third-party software comes in even more. So the idea of using standardized security services or standardized services that have been developed, log management or identity management, whatever it is, right? Don't reinvent the wheel. Use what's been, that's out there. It's also been vetted and has enough eyes on it on a regular basis. And just maintaining, well-secured libraries and modules. And they also talk about a little bit here about obtaining SBOMs from different components of the software that goes into your software, right? So the idea too is how far down do you go, right? If for example, if you have a product that you get an SBOM for and they have sub vendors or et cetera, I mean, how many SBOMs are going to be generated? Is it just for the main piece of software? So it should be interesting to see how that plays out. It also gets into things like, are you following secure coding practices? Are you doing code reviews, static versus dynamic? All the different things that your organization should be doing. They talk a little bit about automation as well, which is nice. So they're really trying to push people towards the idea of, you know, you can have a person doing it, which is fine for some organizations, or if you can, when you can, try to automate as much as possible because you want to make sure that you're not slowing down the process, you're speeding it up, but you're also speeding it up while you're ensuring the integrity of the software.
Yeah, and for some organizations, the idea of doing things manually, and if they're releasing daily or bi-daily, it just is no longer
Yes,
practical in
yeah,
the world of DevOps,
yeah,
right?
it's not
Yeah,
feasible. Yep.
exactly. And that's actually interesting that they do the idea of don't reinvent wheels, which I think is
Yeah,
important. Like you see people like come up with proprietary encryption algorithms, and you're just like,
yeah,
why?
yeah,
You know,
yeah. Why? And when that person leaves who
right,
developed it, they're like, okay, well then
right,
what? And
right. And, yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Okay, so what's the fourth practice?
the fourth practice is going to be responding to vulnerabilities. And this is really comes down to, I talked about it for a second there, of monitoring the vulnerability databases, threat intelligence, having hopefully to be able to automate it somehow, tying, if you can tie, your SBOM to that would be even better, right? If you're able to say, hey, these are the different pieces of my software, and then tying threat intel to that would be, it's great, right? It's the ideal scenario. Also gets into things of like vulnerability disclosures, like what's your policies against disclosing vulnerabilities and software that's out there in the wild to your customers, and remediation policies, things like that. How do you track vulnerabilities, and then how do you calculate the risk? Are you using a standard kind of like risk model, or and then what's the plan to respond to all those things? So it's not just tracking and saying, okay, we do track it, but okay, what are you going to do to respond to it? How are you going to handle inquiries from your customers? How are you going to handle releases, things like that? And then are you doing things like root cause analysis? Are you not just identifying the vulnerabilities and fixing them, but are you looking at what went wrong somewhere in the SDLC, somewhere in your process standards or procedures to say, okay, we had another cross-site scripting vulnerability. Okay, why does this is the third one we've had this year. Is it a training issue? Is it, do we need better coding practices? Like what is really the problem of why does this continue to happen, right? And then that's kind of like the last thing, right? Of continuously reviewing and updating your SDLC to make sure that you're not just spinning your wheels. It's great to shift left, but if you're not shifting left and then being proactive when you do find problems, going back to the root cause and trying to address it, and whether training issues or whatever, is making sure that you're moving forward within your maturity levels within your organization.
Gotcha. So the SSDF, see if I get this right. The SSDF is a tool that we can use to either assess and or help us build and optimize our software development lifecycle methodology
Mhm.
so that the likelihood that it produces a more secure piece of software at the end on a consistent basis is really what it's intended to do. Okay.
Absolutely. I think that's a very, very fair
Okay,
summary.
cool. So if that is right, what drove the US government to issue the
Yeah.
SSDF?
So it started in, I think it was May of 2021, Executive Order, Section 4. Section 4, I believe it's enhancing software supply chain security. And basically, the government was trying to find ways to how do they make sure that they're buying secure software. And it's all about the integrity of the supply chain. And the real priority during the executive order was on critical software, right? Of how do we make sure that when the U.S. government buys critical software, that we're, that this is secure, this is things that should be in our environments, et cetera. So the first question I think a lot of people had was, okay, well, what's critical software mean? What's defined as critical software? I mean, that's different to different people, right? And NIST was nice enough to give us 11 categories of critical software because they're very forward-leaning, and I love the work that NIST does. And they really focused on the idea of it should focus on standalone and on-premises software first. So, and then it listed the kind of 11 categories, and some of the categories, some things that they mentioned were things like identity and access management, right? Especially within the cloud, those are things where everybody's concerned about. Operating systems, hypervisors, also too containers, Dockers, Kubernetes, the world, things like that. They talked a little bit about web browsers, so traditional web browsers, Chrome, Firefox, etc. They talked about endpoint solutions, so EDRs, XDRs, making sure that if that's installed on the local workstation, that's also looked at. They talked about things like network controls, VPN software, DNS resolvers, things like that. They got into more of like network protocols, so like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, IPSs, application firewalls were mentioned in there. And then talked about things like SIMs, so kind of more of like operational monitoring tools, log correlation engines, things like that. Remote scanning, so if you're going to have like a Nessus, something like that, or an OpenVAS, or you can name what your favorite vulnerability scanning tool is, things like that. That's all identified as critical software. And then they kind of close it out talking about remote access and kind of like backup and recovery and remote storage, kind of pieces of software. So, the basics, the normal like ecosystem of a organization, right? The big pieces of it, things that can touch process critical data, things that might give somebody elevated privileges or access, or really kind of how they define critical software.
Interesting. So I'm assuming that was, you could probably trace that to things like SolarWinds and the OpenSSL issue that we talked about prior. Because I'm surprised, and I haven't read that NIST guidance specifically, so you just educated me.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that there was no mention at all of SaaS. I mean, what you really just made mention of is a lot of the critical infrastructure, security infrastructure within an organization, making sure that the tools that we rely on to be secure are actually secure themselves.
Yeah, I think maybe the SaaS stuff was maybe because of FedRAMP. Maybe they thought that there was more, because they're talking about on-premises versus obviously cloud, and they were focusing on on-premises software as critical software. And my guess is maybe because they thought FedRAMP maybe kind of is proactively addressing some of the SaaS type of stuff. So maybe they were like, okay, maybe we can do that second. But that's kind of a guess.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So I think the list you just gave us, right, is those organizations that we know the government will explicitly say we expect this stuff to have gone through SSDF. So for folks that are listening, how would an organization that doesn't explicitly apply to benefit from the SSDF?
So I think the best thing to think is it's going to raise the bar, because I think you might start to see things like SSDF or used as kind of like a marketing thing of like, hey, we align to this. So when I think of organizations that, if we're talking about organizations selling to the government right now, or will be in the future, that don't fall into this category, they eventually will. So I don't want to make it sound like they're talking about starting with critical security or critical software, but the goal is to have this to any piece of software the government procures. And this isn't like CMMC when it's just a DIB. This is government wide, federal government wide. And I think that so if you're producing software, whether it's either incorporated into a larger application or something you're selling directly to the government, it's something that they should be aware of. It also allows them to start now proactively kind of identifying, okay, this is the way that we're going. The whole concept of shifting left is being pushed out by the government. it's going to be adopted by the private sector more and more. And it's something that organizations need to do to stay competitive, I think, as it comes to not just first to market, but also having a secure product that's first to market. I think is going to be hopefully become more the norm in the future.
Yeah, interestingly, we have a client that we work with that produces, I'll loosely call it a healthcare device, and
Hmm.
they are being asked about the SSDF and about an SBOM already. So they're not in the government food chain. This isn't a governmental entity. It's a healthcare entity that's asking them this. So I do think that there's a general recognition of the potential import of this
Hmm.
that I think, if you're producing software or you're producing a device that has software on it, you probably should be cognizant of. And I think there's one other way that you might benefit from this. If you are consuming software, right? One of the best ways to gain some level of assurance and some level of knowledge about how mature their practices are is to ask them about their Sdlc, to ask them if they are SSDF compliant, to ask them if they can produce an SBOM. So your third-party risk management practices, I would suggest that and we're recommending to our clients already that they add these types of issues into their third-party risk management processes.
Yeah, and I think it's like everything else, right? The executive order also talked a lot about zero trust. Now, zero trust has been out before, right? It's been out for a long time, the concept of it in the private sector. But until it came back into the executive order, now everybody's talking about zero trust again. So it's one of those things that the government's kind of like an amplifier, I think, for a lot of these things that, they're not always in front, but when they get there and they start to talk about things, it tends to bring more attention to it. And then you start to see it roll into contracts, start to see it roll into, like you're saying, TPRM programs or things like that, that people are asking more questions around that concept because it's getting more publicity. Um, so no, I definitely agree with you there.
Do we have a schedule yet, if you will? When do we think
Yeah,
SSDF
yeah,
goes into effect?
yes, and good question, right? So interesting enough, so we got to think, right? So SSDF was actually finalized this year, right, in 2022, February, by NIST. A month later, NIST pretty much, OMB actually required federal agencies to adopt the SSDF and said that they need to start implementing it into their risk profiles and how they're going to implement it within their mission, things like that, right? And then a day later, so this all happened in March of 2022, so it was like the 7th of March. The 8th of March, another announcement came out from OMB saying that it's going to work with the private sector over the next 60 days, which puts us about a week or so ago, to talk about how companies have to comply with it. So the attestation requirements for an organization. So everybody right now is just waiting for OMB to really be clear of how companies and when have to really attest to it, right? So obviously first party or third party or something in between, right? So I think the best guess is people think by the end of the year it's going to be maybe required some of the bigger contracts, or it might come out saying, okay, by this time you need to be. But then by next year, it's probably going to be rolling into a lot of different contracts of start critical software probably, and obviously then work its way down the road. But I would think it would be kind of like what you're going to see is probably a similar push to you saw for CMMC, is you might have the big companies, the primes that are like, okay, we're going to start moving a little bit quicker than the smaller companies, and then they're going to probably start putting a little bit more pressure on kind of the subcontractors to be like, hey, you need to start aligning your programs, if you're developing software in our behalf, with the SSDF. So I think you might start seeing a lot, probably towards the end of the year, a lot more of that type of activity.
So, and this is a hard question I know SSDF is new, but so if somebody's sitting here listening to this going, oh crap, this is going to apply to me. And they're like, I don't think our development processes are where they need to be. How long will it take, to go through the process of assessing where they are, and then putting the right mechanisms in place to get to a point that they can either
Yeah.
self-attest, or if there is a third-party attestation to it. I mean, is it going to take them a week? Is it going to take them a month? Is it going to take them a year?
So the quicker part is going to be the gap assessment, right? So that's fairly, a couple weeks, right? So if you're coming to an organization, if you're looking at, okay, this is our program, here are our policies, there are standards, here are the people who develop it, you can talk to them. Traditional gap assessment like you're going to do with any other framework. I think the tough part is making sure the scope is correct, and the boundaries are set up correctly of the actual attestation of, okay, do we understand if the applications we're talking about or development units we're talking about are actually the ones that fall into critical software or need to meet the standard of SSDF. So I think the first conversation you have to have is that important scoping and boundary conversation, right? And kind of the understanding of, okay, what is the application doing? What kind of data does it host? Who are you selling it to? Or or who else is using it? So I think that's extremely important. I mean, it's tough because every organization is different. When you come in, organizations already have SDLCs that may be aligned with OWASP or BSIM or something like that. It's not going to be. It's just going to be a mapping exercise and identifying some of the differences, maybe in the language. Um, but I'd say a few weeks to start out from the gap assessment. The heavy lift is going to be in the remediation. So it's one thing to identify the problem and kind of scope it. It's a whole nother issue to say, okay, we see where you are maturity wise. And the question is, if they're starting from nothing, how do you change all their processes and standards and then train that to the people who are actually developing the software? And that's when you come into, you're looking at months, right? Because you're talking about retraining staff of how to do something. You might be changing the way that their pipeline works. You might be adding additional training requirements to the organization. Might be saying, hey, you don't have this role. You need this feature, this functionality built into the system, and then they have to follow you to operationalize it before you can really attest that it's actually
Yeah.
working. So I think that could
Yeah,
take
and
months.
actually, and you didn't cover a couple of things that could make the months go to many months. Do they need budget? Right. So if you think about
Oh, yeah,
like if
absolutely.
they need like let's say they're working in a particular language, there may be only one or two automated code scanners that really will be effective for them, and you can spend six figures or $50,000 on a code scanner, right? So if you don't have that money
Yeah.
budgeted, you might have to wait a year to get that budgeted. The second thing is, do you have the right people on your team to be able to do the work, right? So it might be not just be a training. You might need more people, or you might need a different type of person.
Yeah.
And right now, we know that there's a tremendous shortage of the kind of people that you'd want, right? The more that's security oriented DevOps or Sec DevOps oriented kind of people. You might be able to get by with
Yeah.
someone more quality oriented or somebody more in that space, but maybe not. So that might be another thing. You might not be able to find the right people to be able to actually affect these changes in your environment.
No, absolutely. I mean, we both know better than most that, attracting, retaining, and being able to grow that talent in any organization is tough. And the application security engineers and that level of individual is extremely hard to attract and retain. So it's going to be for the larger companies, they're going to be fine. They have larger budgets. I'm not saying that it's not going to impact possibly their bottom line, but normally bigger companies are able to deal and kind of absorb these things more proactively and easier. Where I think the challenges are really going to present, and I think where they're presented for things like CMMC, is the SMBs. Is how does a small to medium-sized business take something like an SSDF when they might have a very informal methodology for the SDLC and put this kind of formality around it. Now, the nice thing is the SSDF doesn't tell you how to do everything, right? It's practices and it's tasks, and it's really outcome focused. So, if you take the risk-based approach of saying this is why we do it this way, or this is why this works this way, I mean, it doesn't have to be prescriptive to every possible reference control within the SSDF, and that's the nice part about it. It can be customized to the environment based on risk.
You mentioned OWASP, SAM. You mentioned BSIM. Like, if I asked you just generally, how
Mhm.
would you compare the SSDF to those documents? I mean, is it an analog? Is it how would you compare them?
Yeah. So the OWASP SAM and SAM being security assurance maturity model and BSIM being building security in maturity model are both kind of secure development frameworks, right? For better lack of better part, or maturity models, better word to use. So basically, they're mapped to the SSDF. They're mapped to the different tasks, that are underneath the different practices. And it's different in the sense of the things like the OWASP SAM and BSIM are much more prescriptive of saying exactly what to do. The nice thing about the SSDF is it's mapped to all of these things. So the SSDF is like a high level kind of like framework of things you should do, right? This is the concept, this is the practice, this is the task. But then the references is really where the strength of the SSDF comes into play. Things like OWASP SAM, things like BSIM. It's also mapped to, I think it's like 800, 160, 161, systems engineering, and then the supply chain risk management stuff. Um, and that's where the prescriptive type of text comes in of, okay, this is the general concept from the practice and the task level, but this is kind of how you would achieve that. And that's really the power of it. Of the SSDF is just a framework. It's just saying, hey, this is kind of what we're trying to hope. This is kind of they give notional examples, which shouldn't be taken verbatim, but they give notional examples of what that could actually look like. So the nice thing about it, it's mapped to all those different frameworks and different standards, which get into more of the weeds. They actually have maturity models in them built into them as well, which is really nice. So your organization might be at maturity level 1, for OWASP SAM or BSIM, but it meets the overall objective of the practice of the task. And then you can actually look at it and say, okay, I meet the bare minimum, and I'm at maturity level 1, and you can actually work your way up to kind of give yourselves kind of a roadmap to, okay, I get it, I meet the bare minimum, but how do I now, increase the efficiency of my program? So
Gotcha.
it's
So
pretty nice.
simply speaking, the SSDF is the what and why, and then it gives you references to things like OWASP and BSIM for potential ways how. So it's a non-prescriptive framework,
Yes,
the SSDF. Okay, cool.
yes.
All right, we beat this up pretty good. Is there anything we missed?
What did we miss? I think we hit a lot of it. I think the one thing I really like about it is the fact that the advantage is right. It's broadly applicable. It provides organizations a roadmap. And the fact that it is mapped to well-known standards tells me that they understand that, hey, listen, this is definitely a framework. Like, if you really want to get into the weeds and find what's relevant to your organization, this is where to go. So the nice thing about it is, um, you know, organizations that have a mature Sdlc, they're not going to have to reinvent the wheel. They're not going to have to change anything. It's just basically a mapping exercise. So I think that's really nice. Um, I think I think anytime a new standard comes out, I always kind of hold my breath for a second because you're really going to be worried about, are we making this overly complicated? Are we going to make organizations now have to jump through additional hoops that are going to increase costs and things like that? And while the SSDF is going to make organizations do mapping exercises or do the gap assessments, things like that, I think it's well intentioned, and I think it has to happen. The idea of shifting left has to happen from a standpoint of information security. Getting, proactively trying to get in front of vulnerabilities within software is extremely important. And I don't see how else outside of doing this and really getting to the point of, are we building secure software, of how you start to reduce the back end cost of penetration testing and vulnerability assessments, all these things that, are still important, but that's not where the investment should really be. You need to start shifting left and invest in building
Right.
quality code.
So SSDF, well done. We're secure by design. We're not relying on, secure by good fortune.
Right, exactly. Right, yeah. Which is the pen test can lead you to believe sometimes.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Substantive testing is not the way to know that you
yeah,
have a secure application.
yeah. I did want to bring up one more thing that I forgot to mention about
Hmm.
the attestations.
Hmm.
So NIST did kind of put some stuff out there when they were recommending. They did recommend that the government start with first-party attestations, and then kind of like take a risk-based approach to having third-party attestations. And they actually recommended against providing like low-level artifacts as part of the process. I think the idea was the government doesn't have the expertise to review, a bunch of like very complicated and well-detailed SBOMs and a bunch of other artifacts that will slow down the procurement process. So they made it. They're kind of focusing really on, requesting high-level artifacts, and I think that's probably going to be how this starts off. So it'd be interesting to see how OMB comes out with their guidance and what they're requesting.
Yeah, and for anyone that's thinking to themselves, "Oh, that's great. I can just send a letter that says I'm secure."
Right.
I will say this is that I think the government is getting smarter about how to hold people's feet to the fire with CMMC, of course, we've got some level of assessment, but even just the requirement for a senior authorizing official to sign off on a document with the threat of, and then ramping up the Department of Justice, what the civil cyber fraud,
Yeah.
civil,
False Claims
yeah,
Act.
and then I mean,
Yeah.
they recovered $20 billion plus in 2020. I don't know what 2021 brought,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, so if they're going to, if they do what they did with Sarbanes-Oxley and they do what they're doing with some instances of CMMC, and it requires a senior official to sign off at that risk, I think people are going to probably take it pretty serious.
Absolutely. And I think the last thing anybody wants is to fall into that crowd, right? Of, okay, we said we did it. Here's our piece of paper, but it's like the SPRS score, right? Of everybody has 110, right? Well, do you? So when you start to ask those questions and you start to dig into it a little bit, and if you have the whistleblower programs that a lot of these things are coming from, the False Claims Act is not something anybody wants to be associated with.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
Yeah.
So give me a fictional character or a real world person you think would make an amazing or horrible CISO, and why?
Let's think about this. I think I think the amazing CISO, I think would be had to be a comedian because, and it doesn't matter who it is, um,
No, you
because
have to you have to give me a name. You have to give me a name.
yeah, I would go with like old school, like Rodney Dangerfield or somebody like
Rodney
that, like doesn't get any
Dangerfield.
respect. Maybe something like that. CISOs are getting a lot more respect, so I'm not saying they're not. But I think you need the personality of, with the amount of changes and the amount of standards and frameworks and the workload, you kind of gotta have a ability to laugh about it, or it's hard to keep your sanity in the world of InfoSec.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why, like, you always hear me say, like, it's serious work that we don't do seriously
Yeah,
sometimes,
yeah,
because
yeah.
because if you don't laugh, you cry, right? I mean, it's as
Yeah,
simple as that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I came from the world of law enforcement and, being a criminal investigator, and it's the same thing of, you're dealing with sometimes very serious topics, and, sometimes you'll see people smiling or giggling because if you don't laugh, you cry sometimes, and it's one of those things that you gotta kind of find, the humor in a lot of things.
Yeah, and if you think about it, I mean, I mean, the best funerals I've been to are a bunch of people sitting around laughing and
Yeah,
celebrating someone's life,
yeah,
for
absolutely.
that same reason. All right, this was awesome. Uh, if folks want to get in contact with you, what's the easiest way?
Email address, elzar.camper@pivotpointsecurity.com, or go to the Pivot Point Security website, reach out, say hello, be happy to talk.
Sounds good, man. Well, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.